In light of the United States-India summit held in Washington in June, do you think the meeting between President Joe Biden and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi also highlights a shift in the global balance of power?
A profound and extensive change is taking place in the world. Let's put it this way. The non-Western parts of the world are experiencing rapid economic growth. I'm talking about countries like India, China, certain parts of Africa, and Latin America, which were poor in the past 2 centuries, but are currently showing significant progress in catching up. If you consider the European Union with a population of around 450 million and the United States with 335 million inhabitants, it accounts for only 10% of the world's population. So the majority of the world, which is still relatively poor, but reducing the gap, lies outside of this.
Seeing this, do you think the United States and the West can accept that there is a certain shift towards developing countries? In fact, it's not just towards developing countries, but towards economic powers such as China or India. Will the West accept that it no longer exclusively wields global influence?
I believe that Europe roughly understands this, although ideas about a European empire still arise occasionally, but these are mostly remnants of the past. In the United States, there is a very strong financial and ideological entity known as the military-industrial complex, which currently does not accept this viewpoint. In my opinion, it represents a significant destabilizing factor in the world. This entity still wants the United States to be dominant over Russia and China. They think that the United States will create an anti-China alliance with India, but this is a very naive and unrealistic notion. I think the majority of the American people are not concerned about whether the United States is the first, second, or fifth largest power in the world because we have so many problems at home. The American people would be completely happy if their government focused on the problems that have accumulated domestically. However, the mentioned military-industrial complex is a strong and dominant player in American foreign policy, which still imagines that the United States is the leading superpower. Furthermore, many European countries, at least currently, subscribe to this idea because many European leaders confuse the European Union with Nato and unfortunately equate them, which is a regrettable mistake. So my answer is that a good and peaceful transition to a truly multipolar world is possible, but there are those who oppose it in the United States.
You mentioned the defense industry, which is a huge economic sector and a source of revenue and profit for the industries involved. This brings us immediately to the issue of the war in Ukraine, in which Russia is the aggressor. Yet the question arises, who benefits from peace and ending this bloody war?
This war broke out because the United States insisted on NATO expanding eastward and pushed for this to happen in Ukraine and Georgia as well. However, Ukraine and Georgia are red lines that cannot be crossed for Russia. Don't do it, the Russians said. The United States, however, was so dismissive, despite the fact that for 3 decades, Russia has been saying, don't dare bring your missiles, bases, and armies to Ukraine, that America thought they were just bluffing. What could Russia do, as it is so weak, and we can do whatever we want? However, President Putin called their bluff. The United States still insists on NATO's presence in Ukraine, and even NATO leaders say they will, of course, expand the organization to Ukraine. Most European leaders, with the exception of Prime Minister Orban, say that NATO will naturally expand to Ukraine. But this is the recipe for endless war and crisis. Thus, the Russian-Ukrainian war was provoked by American aspirations for hegemony. And if we had left Russia alone, had not confronted it with the possibility of NATO expansion in Ukraine, this war would never have broken out.
At the same time, Washington argues that Western military support only serves to assist Ukraine in protecting its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The United States claims to support Ukraine as long as necessary. But where are the hopes for a peace agreement?
There could have been peace in December 2021 when President Putin put a draft agreement on the table with the United States, which was based on Ukraine's neutrality. But Washington rejected it. There could have been peace in April 2022 when Russia and Ukraine negotiated an agreement based on Ukraine's neutrality. The United States rejected that too. The day when the President of the United States, Joe Biden, came out in public and said that Russia must call home its army and the United States will never allow NATO to expand to Ukraine. This could have been the basis for ending the war. But Biden is unwilling to say this because he disagrees. He has been among those who support NATO expansion for 30 years, as does his environment, as do the top brass of the American military, the generals. They do not want peace. They want continuing war until the United States achieves its goal.
I attended a press conference led by John Kirby, the spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, who argued that the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy is one of cooperation. Over the past 2 years, however, we have seen unprecedented political and economic division develop globally. This raises the question, how effective is this cooperative foreign policy, and how successful is it?
In this sense, Biden is a neoconservative, having been part of the aforementioned military-industrial complex throughout his congressional career as vice president and now as president. He doesn't support collaboration with others whom he calls allies and friends. He says that the greatest challenge and basis for division in the world today is the divide between democracies and autocracies. However, this is nonsense. And it's dangerous because the world is not structured that way, and it should not be so bifurcated. The world should be unified in order to face common challenges, whether it's in regards to the functioning of the world economy, the preservation of the natural environment, or the ever-increasing uncertainty. And yet we don't do this, but instead try to expand NATO, increase military budgets, and speak aggressively about China. After Secretary of State Blinken's seemingly reasonable and constructive visit to Beijing, the next day, President Biden restarted and called President Xi Jinping a dictator. One wonders what kind of China policy this is. The world does not want this kind of destabilization. It does not need this foreign policy. The United States must contribute to ending the war in Ukraine, understanding that Russia also has legitimate security interests. These must be negotiated also to protect Ukraine and ensure that the security interests of every country are upheld.
New York Times repeats the falsehood all the time that this was an unprovoked action on February 24th, 2022, seemingly wanting us to be without any context or history to understand where this conflict came from and how it can end. And a newspaper like the New York Times has a responsibility to tell the truth, and they're not doing it.
Indeed. As citizens, we have the right, a country is not looking after, in the US, the prosperity of its own citizens, going out, conducting these irresponsible wars when we don't have time with other things with the environment. Ironically, what seems to be behind it all is this insistence on a unipolar world, insistence on dominance. And while the US wants to hold on to its status as a reserve currency, it seems under those economic sanctions that US has also suffered, it might even be hastening, strengthening the currencies of other countries.
Well, the basic point is the U.S. has 4.1% of the world population, so how could it presume to be the world leader? The U.S. is a powerful country, it's a rich country, but it doesn't run the world, and it should not aspire to run the world. That's a kind of madness. And the U.S. ideology for a long time has been that the U.S. should run the world. It's, to my mind, unbelievable. But then again, I've spent most of my career outside the U.S. seeing the other 95.9% of the world. And I know that the other 95% of the world doesn't want the United States to run the world. It's not against the United States. It just says, let us have our own part of the world. We don't want you running the world. We don't want you deciding what our government is, who we are, how we rule ourselves. You're just one place. And this, the United States leaders don't understand. They're very arrogant. They're very ignorant because of the two big oceans. They're very unaware of the history of other parts of the world. And we end up with this arrogant and naive and dangerous foreign policy, because there's no doubt the United States is rich and powerful, and it makes lots of weapon systems. And I'm 68 years old, and the United States has been at war almost every year of my life, from Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and Nicaragua and Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Libya and now Ukraine. Come on, give it a break. And the U.S. is also experiencing the reality that other places in the world are catching up on technology, indeed leading on technologies as well. And China's a very successful, very industrious, very hardworking society, which in the last 40 years has gone from poverty to a very significant world important economy. And the U.S. has a very hard time accepting that. The U.S. attitude, if you listen to congressmen who don't seem to know anything, is, oh, if China's successful, it must be because they're cheating. What about because they're saving more than 40% of GDP, that the Chinese people have been engaging in a remarkable upgrading of education, hundreds of thousands of PhDs minted each year, massive scientific research programs. Come on, this is the truth. And so this arrogance is not allowing the truth to come through. But you mentioned one specific point, which is the role of the U.S. dollar. Part of the U.S. strength after World War II is, well, the U.S. was basically the only economy standing, and it was a technologically advanced, rich, large economy, the world's largest. And the dollar was really the only internationally usable currency for quite a long time. So the dollar system became the center of how you do international trade. When you trade in goods, they're denominated in dollars. When you buy the imports, you pay in dollars, meaning you use accounts in U.S. dollars, typically in the U.S. banking system. When the transaction is closed, it's closed through the so-called SWIFT interbank system. And so the U.S. has had what France long ago called an exorbitant privilege, that it could print a lot of money because the rest of the world was holding dollars, using dollars. The dollar was the basis of the world economy. That's changing now. And it's changing for three basic reasons. One is the share of the U.S. in the world economy is diminishing. So this means that the predominance of the U.S. is bound to diminish. The second is technologically, settlements are going to occur in all sorts of ways other than through U.S. banks. And so-called digital currencies, especially central bank digital currencies, will mean other ways to make settlements. We'll settle in renminbi when we buy in China, or settle in rubles, or settle in rupees when trade is with India, and so forth. So there will be multiple currencies. And then the third part, which is really a matter of a bad set of decision making, the U.S. has militarized the dollar, meaning that usually you think about money, well, you have it, you can use it, you can spend it. But the United States has come to say, if we don't like you, you don't necessarily have access to your money anymore if it's in our banks. So the U.S. froze the dollar holdings of Russia. The U.S. has frozen the dollar holdings of Venezuela. The U.S. froze the dollar holdings of Afghanistan. My advice to any government that's not getting along with the U.S. government is be careful about your money, because the U.S. might come in and freeze your money. And so countries are looking to hold their reserves in other ways now. Perfectly understandable. And I think that this is another part of the move to a multi-currency international system from a dollar-based international system.
And you mentioned the possibility of a reserve currency being the renminbi. And so there's other things that are not often reported about China. One, and I know that you've written about this as well, is that they're stepping in where America's policy of destabilizing and it's destructive. China, in some cases in the Middle East, is stepping in as a peacemaker, and it's less expensive if we can achieve peace.
Well, probably the most remarkable diplomatic achievement of recent years, I would say, is China brokering a peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. In the American idea, those two countries were implacable foes. They could never agree. And for the United States, Iran was the enemy, and Saudi Arabia was the ally. But the whole idea of U.S. foreign policy is you bring countries under your authority as an ally of the United States, like Saudi Arabia, and you fight your enemies on the other side. But China has a different idea, which is that Saudi Arabia and Iran had no fundamental reasons for this dissension, but they have plenty of reasons for cooperation. For one thing, they're both being hard hit by climate change. They need to cooperate because the water crisis is quite severe. They're both hydrocarbon economies. They need an energy transformation, which is very profound. And so the Chinese facilitated a reconciliation between the two. I'm very happy about that reconciliation, by the way. The fighting between, the bitterness between Iran and Saudi Arabia divided Western Asia. It contributed to an absolutely devastating war in Yemen, in which the United States gave its military support that killed a lot of people. And it destabilized a region that needs a lot of economic transformation and technological upgrading and change. And so this agreement is really a big help for the whole region, not only for the two countries involved.
You have just spent, I think, 1 year in Europe, in Vienna, and
Yes.
in some other places. What is the most important take you have from this stay in Europe? What's your dominant impression of the state of Europe?
I was very disappointed because most of Europe's leaders are right now simply following whatever the United States says. And whether this is because of their belief in Europe's security, whether it's their belief that the US will punish them if they deviate from the line. The state of European politics is quite bad, and the war has made things worse because Europe is with a dominant narrative like the United States that is basically given by the US security establishment and then repeated in the mainstream media in Europe. So it was, at a political level, really disappointing. At a personal level, it was wonderful. Vienna is a fantastic place. It is the result of decades of social democratic philosophy and ethos and social housing, and we had a fabulous time. And I also came to admire more and more the wise decision of both the Soviet Union and Austria in 1955 to make a very good deal, that the Soviets would leave Austria and the Austrians would declare neutrality, and that this would be the basis going forward. And it proved its great worth, and I tried to sell that approach for free to give the advice to Ukraine repeatedly, but they didn't understand that it's much better to be a neutral Austria than a NATO aspirant partner of the United States. As Henry Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And Ukraine has believed that the U.S. is going to provide security, and what the U.S. is providing is the dismemberment of Ukraine.
Your Austrian neutrality makes us Swiss a little bit proud, because in the constitution of Austria it says they want to have a neutrality Swiss style.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. I mean, that Switzerland was the role model for neutrality in Austria. What's your relationship with Switzerland?
And this is,
Switzerland,
of course, extremely smart, and it served Switzerland very well. It served Austria very well, and ironically, it served Sweden and Finland very well. And they abandoned this this year, shockingly naively, thinking that Russia's about to invade Finland or Sweden. No. And all of the benefits of neutrality they gave up overnight because of these right-wing parties that don't understand or pretend not to understand the current geopolitics.
Even in Switzerland, there are people in the establishment who think that neutrality has to be given up or neutrality has to be made more flexible, that Switzerland can deliver weapons to one party in the war. What do you say about that? I mean, what's your take on that? I mean, should Switzerland give up neutrality? Would that be a wise course?
No. There's nothing more to add. Switzerland's one of the most successful countries of modern history. Why would you give up the basis of success?
Ja, as Goethe said, nichts ist schwerer zu ertragen als eine Folge von guten Tagen. Good days are hard to bear, and sometimes if you're very successful, you start to forget what made you successful.
Well, it's interesting. Every day I walk by Goethe on the Ringstrasse in Vienna because he's got a big statue just near the opera house. And so I paid respect to Goethe every day.
Okay. You have been commenting, of course, the war in Ukraine in the recent months extensively. How do you assess the situation at the moment? Give us a brief oversight of your perception.
I think it's probably accurate or roughly accurate that about 40,000 Ukrainians have died in the last 2 months of what is a failed counteroffensive promoted by the United States. So this has been a disastrous period. Ukraine will not achieve on the battlefield its goals. This was clear from the very beginning, but the US has always said otherwise. And remember, I'm 68 years old, so I've heard the fairy tales of US generals for more than 6 decades. They always say, yes, success is just around the corner. This next offensive is going to be great. The surge is going to be decisive, and so forth. So I've heard this so many times in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Nicaragua, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and heard it again in Ukraine. What's very sad is that Ukraine is being destroyed in this process because the US has wanted to push Ukraine to Nato, and Russia, for completely predictable and understandable reasons, said no. And the United States believed that Russia was bluffing, or that if not bluffing, that it had no alternative but to bend to the US will. And this has not been the case. And Biden is not a very clever man, unfortunately, and his team is not very clever. Obama was more clever than Biden. And Obama knew in 2014, though Obama helped to start this disaster when the US helped to overthrow Yanukovych, Obama knew at that time, don't go deeper into this. Because as he said in an interview, Russia has escalatory dominance. Whatever we do, Russia will escalate. And the reason is, for Russia, this is existential. For the United States, it's nice. Wouldn't it be nice if Ukraine were in NATO? We would control the Black Sea. That's nice. But for Russia, it's absolutely existential. And so Obama already understood in 2014, don't escalate because Russia will continue to escalate. You can't bluff Russia out of this. Biden, who's not very clever, just thought, well, what will Putin do? We'll just keep pushing. And when Putin put on the table in December 2021 a draft agreement for security arrangements between the US and Russia, by the way, I called the White House to say, negotiate. This is absolutely negotiable. I was told, no, we're not going to negotiate. And the US told Russia, no, not interested in negotiating. NATO is none of your business. It was literally the line. And Putin said, it is my business, and has shown it. And this is a complete disaster for Ukraine. Probably the population has has declined by maybe 10 million from emigres on the one hand, or the Russia-controlled territory on the other hand, and the bloodbath continues. And NATO has, I won't even say NATO, this is a small group in the US leadership. They have no answer, but they have the election coming up in November 2024. So they think they need to continue this so as not to show weakness or defeat. This is where we are right now. It's a complete tragedy for Ukraine.
How will it play out? I mean, it's always hard to say, of course, to look into the future, but what is the most probable outcome you see in this war?
There will be ongoing large-scale killing and destruction until honesty prevails, and honesty will mean that the US will be clear that NATO enlargement to Ukraine is not going to take place and not going to happen, and it's not an objective, and then the fighting will stop. And when the fighting stops, there will be major territorial issues. One, I think, was fated from the beginning, and that is that Crimea will remain in Russian hands, as it was and has continued to be Russia's naval base in Sevastopol since 1783. It's not going to Ukraine, other than it's not going to Ukraine, period. And then the issues of the Donbass and Kherson district and Zaporizhia. This is really a mess right now, because in December 2021, we should remember Russia was making no territorial claims, even for the Donbass. What Russia was calling for was honoring the Minsk agreements. And the US stupidly, and Ukraine stupidly, wouldn't honor agreements that had been signed and backed unanimously by the UN Security Council. Well, Russia is now dismantling the country geographically, and with so many losses on the Russian side, the belief that, well, okay, we'll just go back to where we were is a little naive. So this is a mess. I don't have any clear answer. What I've said every day from December 2021 until now is sit down and negotiate, because it's getting worse. And in the meantime, Ukrainians are dying at a rate of maybe 1,000 a day right now, or 1,000 dead and seriously wounded. And this is absolutely disastrous.
The dominant narrative, even in Switzerland, in the German-speaking part of Europe, I don't know, probably also in the United States, is that Putin is trying to reassemble the Soviet Union. His plan is to create a greater Russia, and to negotiate with Putin would be appeasement policy, which was doomed against Hitler. These historical analogies are being made. Why is this narrative wrong in your eyes?
Well, because the real context is that the American empire is the one that keeps expanding, or the intention of it. And by, that's a provocative phrase that Americans are not allowed to say. But the American military alliance, NATO, is the active agent here of expansion. And this counters all that was said to Gorbachev in 1990. It's a direct violation of common sense, as well as commitments that were made back in 1990, that as the Soviet Union dismantled the Warsaw Pact, NATO would not take advantage of that in any way. And of course, the famous expression was not 1 inch eastward. And as soon as the Soviet Union ended, I was actually in the room in the Kremlin when that happened because I was advisor to Boris Yeltsin. So this is, for me, not only history books, but being there. The United States, unbeknownst, of course, to me and to the world at the time, because everything is done secretly, said, okay, now we start expanding NATO. And from the early 1990s onward, this was set in motion. And our top diplomats warned repeatedly, don't do that. Our greatest diplomat of the age, George Kennan, after all, the author of Containment itself in 1947, said, do not expand NATO. Our Secretary of Defense at the time, William Perry, said, do not do this. Our ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, a wonderful diplomat, said, do not do this. This will start us down a path of new confrontation. What's interesting is that for the first few years, the first wave of expansion, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, I think Russia was very unhappy, but said, okay, that's Central Europe. But then the next swath under George W. Bush Jr. was, of course, right against the Black Sea, Bulgaria, Romania, the Baltic states, Slovakia and Slovenia, 7 in one wave. The Russians said, stop this already. And Putin went to the Munich Security Conference in 2007. People should read the speech. Of course, not only do they not read the speech, our mainstream media absolutely tried to deflect us from any history, from any memory, from any context. But Putin said, stop expanding. You promised us no expansion. Now you keep expanding. And this is extraordinarily dangerous for our national security, what you're doing. So what was the U.S. response? In 2008, George W. Bush Jr. insisted that NATO will go not only to Ukraine, but to Georgia. Okay, now it turns out this was part of a timeline that was already deeply set. This wasn't just George W. Bush Jr., though he didn't have to follow through. Zbig Brzezinski explained all of this in Foreign Affairs magazine in 1997 in an article called Strategy for Eurasia. He even gave the timetable. He said Ukraine's membership will come between 2005 and 2010. And if you're experienced in US politics, an article in Foreign Affairs like that is not just some author's thinking. It's a reflection of what is in train. Little bit trial balloon, but mainly explanation of the timeline. Now, in 2008, European leaders were aghast at what Bush had done. And some of them talked to me. And they told me.
Angela Merkel
not Angela Merkel personally, no.
But she said at the time, if Ukraine would be part of NATO, this would be a cause for war for Russia. Even Merkel said it.
Exactly. So this was all known. And what is so sad about the European leaders is none of them tells the truth right now. They're all so scared of the United States or of their public or of the ability to manipulate the mass media and the perception from below or to speak out of line. But I know what they said because they said it to me. They said it to me personally. And by the way, just as recently as a few weeks ago, one of Europe's top leaders, I said to him, I won't go farther to say who, but I said, the day Biden says NATO's not enlarging, then we really can get to the end of the war. And he said to me, I agree with you completely. And then he said exactly the opposite the next day, by the way, in public. So I know it from my own view. So this story, just to finish the story, the disaster, the fuse was lit in 2008. But then the US cannot stop playing games. That's the biggest problem. US foreign policy is covert. It's not that you can't figure it out, but it's secret, it's deniable. And so what happens in 2014 in February? The United States, together with right-wing nationalists in Ukraine, work together to overthrow Yanukovych. Clear as can be. And not only that, thanks to the services of Russia, we even have it on tape with Victoria Nuland talking to U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Piat about who the next government will be. Basically 4 weeks before Yanukovych is violently overthrown. And they pick the next prime minister and explain why. It can't be Klitschko, it's got to be this one. And it just went down that way. And our newspapers, oh, they won't say a word about it. It's on tape. Oh, that doesn't matter. We can ignore it. We can ignore everything. So that's when the explosion came. The war started with the overthrow of the Yanukovych government. Now, oh, so many people, Sachs, what a Putin apologist, what a conspiracy theorist. Of course, people, if you don't look a little bit or people don't tell you things, then you don't know. But let me advise people, just for example, there's a very nice book written by a very fine scholar in 2017 called Covert Regime Change. And it's about US foreign policy from 1947 to 1989. And it documents 64 covert regime change operations of the US government. So that's the business of the US government, overthrowing other governments. They're called covert, but there's a lot of trace. I've been actually in places where governments have been overthrown. I watched, and then I see that the New York Times won't even report the story because it's a game from the US point of view. So in February 2014, the US again engaged in a regime change operation and thought we can get away with it. Now we have a pro-NATO government. We've just overthrown the neutral government. Now we have a pro-NATO government. And immediately the new government says, yeah, we want to join NATO. And immediately the arms flows start from the United States, billions of dollars of arms flows. And this continues through Trump. It continues through the uprisings in the Donbass. It continues with Russia taking back Crimea. And then in 2021, we have a new president who some of us thought would be sane and responsible. He's probably sane, but he's completely irresponsible. And 3 times in 2021, the United States government recommitted to Ukraine's membership in NATO at the highest levels in big security documents, as well as in the NATO summit in 2021. And that's when Putin put on the table at the end of 2021 a draft agreement for new security arrangements between the US and Russia. And Putin kept saying, by the way, look, you're putting Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. They're a few minutes from Moscow. What are you putting in those missile chambers? We don't even know, because you backed out of the ABM treaty, you backed out of the INF treaty. And so Putin's got a point. And now the US wants to move up to the 2,300 kilometer border with Russia. And for those who still think that this is, anyone who reads anything knows that this is a 30 years process. This is not about Putin reconstructing the Russian Empire. That's a nice little joke told by the US security state, as opposed to any of the things I've just described. But if you just go online and look at the Russian National Security Council meeting of February 21st, 2022, you get a perfectly plain explanation of what this military operation is about, because Putin goes around the room and calls on everybody and calls on Lavrov, among others, and says, Minister Lavrov, what is the situation with our proposals for security arrangements? And Lavrov says, Mr. President, we put them on the table, and the United States has given us the formal notice that it will not negotiate on these points, and that as a formal principle, the United States will not discuss NATO enlargement with Russia because it's none of our business, because that is the formal foreign policy doctrine of the United States of America. Well, I can't think of a stupider one, by the way, to say that NATO enlargement, with all that it entails, up to Russia's border is none of Russia's business, so we don't even discuss it with Russia. Well, you might think a war could break out as a result of that, and it has. Really, what China, and I think now the others, are looking towards is a way to do business without being vulnerable to the U.S. coming in and freezing accounts or dictating who can do what to whom. The U.S. absolutely, in my view, wrongly, even disastrously militarized the dollar. It said, you can use the dollar, you can't use the dollar. You think those are your foreign exchange reserves? No, we locked them up. The United States, after all, started in 2022 in its sanctions against Russia by freezing $300 billion of Russia's accounts. It also did something completely weird, in my view, and so lawless, I could not have imagined it, which is to say, you're a friend of Putin, you no longer have your apartment. You're a friend of Putin, you no longer have your house. Anyway, it's bizarre that this is even contemplated, much less done to a lot of people. But in any event, the U.S. froze the balances of multiple countries, the Forex balances, foreign exchange reserves. And not only Russia, Venezuela was an extraordinary case. One day, the Trump administration said, Mr. Maduro, you're not president. Juan Guaido is president. Well, how do you know? Because we said so. We create our own reality. And bizarrely enough, on that basis, the United States froze Venezuela's own money. So what's happening right now is countries saying, why are we doing this? Especially countries that, might have a foreign policy disagreement with the United States and don't want to see their economy tanked. So the essence of what they're looking for is how to make settlements that don't go through U.S. banks and therefore that are not subject to the U.S. regulatory reach to freeze a payment. As a monetary economist, my view is this is not very hard. You can settle in multiple ways. And this is the point that they're all making in the Brics summit, which is why should India and Russia or China and Brazil settle in dollars and be vulnerable to the U.S. Treasury, to CFIUS, to all of these committees that one day to the next can say that's not really your money. They want a reliable payments mechanism. And I think over the next year, that's what they're going to devise. They will settle in renminbi, they will settle in rubles, they will settle in rupees, and they may make a unit of account that's based on perhaps the starting 5 R currencies, the ruble, that's the real, the ruble, the rupee, the renminbi, and the rand. So it happened that the 5 original BRICS countries are all R currencies, and they talk about a 5 R unit of account now. Now they've added the real with Saudi Arabia and with Iran, so maybe it'll be 7 R's in the core basket. It won't be a currency. It may be a unit of account for uh, for denomination of contracts and so forth. They could very well create swap lines across the central banks of the BRICS countries. I would imagine that they would do so to ensure liquidity in this system. Just like the SDR can be issued ex nihilo, out of nothing, in the IMF, which basically means that central banks agree to swap their currencies in essence. The same can happen within the BRICS countries. What they will do, in short, is to create alternative payments mechanisms that don't use US banks. Great success for the US. They brought it on themselves, absolutely predictably. My view is the role of the dollar is going to diminish tremendously. The whole economics literature is, no, this doesn't happen. This will take decades. No, this will happen quickly because of the politics. I don't mean 1 year to the next, but over the next few years. It'll happen for two fundamental reasons. One is that the US militarized the dollar. And the second is that because of digital technologies, the ways to work around even the banking system in straight digital settlements is absolutely clear right now. So the mechanics of creating a non-dollar transaction system, I think, is much, much better technologically than even 5 years ago.
The other thing I'm going to say, because I think this needs to be said, is that none of this, you said that what's happening to the dollar is not in the interests of the United States. None of this, in my opinion, is in the interests of the United States. The United States is subordinating the prosperity of its own people to the geopolitical objectives that it has to sustain its own hegemony. And I should say, just before we did this program, I was reading two articles that you sent us, both written by, they're summaries of articles of the people who were on the Council for Foreign Relations. And they talk about revitalizing the US economy in order to meet the challenge from China. And I have to say, that seems to me an absolutely warped sense of priorities. You don't revitalize your economy in order to meet the challenge from China. If you're going to revitalize your economy, you do it in order to increase the prosperity, the happiness, the sense of contentment in your own country amongst your own people. But that is the mindset that these people seem to have. They subordinate everything to their geopolitical ideas.
It's so well said, Alexander. You know, the main problem in the United States is we have become a plutocracy, massive inequality, a lot of people suffering. No one pays any attention to that. It's not the Republicans, not the Democrats, period. So even when they, quote, revitalize the US economy in the Biden fashion, what are they doing? It's more corporate tax cuts for everything. So everything is basically, we'll give tax cuts for, building semiconductors. We'll give tax cuts for renewable energy, whatever it is. But the whole modus operandi is corporate driven top to bottom. So we're just exacerbating the inequalities. And the real telltale point of all of this is not the GDP, it's life expectancy, which has been falling for a decade in the United States now. We're back to the life expectancy of the mid-1990s. People in the United States are ill. They're not getting taken care of. They don't have access to decent nutrition. They don't have access to healthcare services. That's not even on the agenda. What's on the agenda? The war in Ukraine, Taiwan weaponry, fighting China. So you put it exactly right.
Was Yellen's visit really about asking China not to dump treasuries? How did the U.S. expect it to succeed after Biden insulted Xi? What leverage does the U.S. have to make it happen?
Of course, I don't know what was said in the room. I've known our Treasury Secretary for 50 years because in 1973, 50 years ago, I sat in a classroom when a wonderful young professor from Yale came and taught me macroeconomics. So I go back 50 years with Janet Yellen, and she's a very decent and wonderful person. The message that she carries comes from an administration that I am not very sympathetic to. And my advice to this administration was, if you go to say we're not out to undermine your economy, the first thing you should say is we will not impose more unilateral measures before we negotiate with you. In other words, stop the unilateralism. That was the recommendation I made. It was obviously not followed because just after Secretary Yellen's trip, Biden signed a new executive order cutting off more technology to China. So the message that that Secretary Yellen carried, that we're not aiming to derail, we don't want to decouple and so forth, whatever it was undermined immediately afterward by the actions of the Biden administration, which took yet another step to try to undermine China. And however much they say, oh, we're not trying to undermine China, of course they're trying to undermine China. It's plain as can be. And so they should stop that. If they want to have actual normal relations with China, the first thing you do is stop putting on unilateral measures and start really talking, not in one trip, but in actual discussion and negotiation. And that doesn't happen till this day. The Biden administration came in, and whether it is the neocon ideology, which is pervasive with Biden, whether it was fear of Trump, that he won the Midwest states with an anti-China protectionist election platform, probably both of those, Biden came out blazing anti-China. And also a point that Alexander made, and I think should be reiterated, the trash talking is nonstop about China. So Secretary Yellen goes, soon after President Biden says, well, President Xi's a dictator. Come on. Or bad things happen to bad people. You know, this is also Biden. He's a kind of got a really obnoxious side, and he thinks that he's real tough when he's speaking to the donors to show how macho he is. So these are all stupid statements coming out of donor sessions, and Biden always likes to swagger. An 80-year-old guy swaggering in this pathetic way is really pathetic, but it's trash talk. And so I don't know what was said inside, but I can say that it cannot be successful to have any kind of normal relations with this kind of unilateral behavior. And it's amazing. I was just rereading one of the articles by the Council on Foreign Relations, which says, in this sense, there is no real prospect of building fundamental trust, peaceful coexistence, mutual understanding, a strategic partnership, or a new type of major country relations between the U.S. and China. Rather, the most that can be hoped for is caution and restrained predictability. In other words, the U.S. position always is, we don't want to have trust. We don't want to have anything. We don't necessarily want to have war, though sometimes they do. But it's going to be bad. You know, we're going to be tough. Even saying the idea of fundamental trust or peaceful coexistence, don't even think about it. That's the real American attitude. Don't have a real discussion with Chinese counterparts.
The West is hurting China by going belly up and no longer being able to buy Chinese exports. Problem is China has not been able to substitute U.S. demand. What do you think about that statement?
Well, it's not that the West can't buy Chinese exports. It's stopped because of high tariffs and barriers and threats to U.S. companies and warnings, don't go there and don't produce goods in China for resale to the US market, and so forth. So the idea is stop demand for Chinese products, throw China into a Japan kind of crisis. And indeed, China has to find other markets, and the world is big. And that is what China is doing, which is saying, okay, we are not going to beg to get into a US market for a country that evidently can't even think about peaceful coexistence. We have to find our way in the world. And what China is doing is forging economic cooperation with most of the rest of the world. And most of the rest of the world means ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia. It means African countries. It means West Asia, the Gulf countries. It means Central Asian countries, the STANs. It means South American countries. And China has several initiatives. The best known is the Belt and Road Initiative, which basically says we save a lot. The Chinese have a very high saving rate. We can provide finance for our partners, our counterpart countries, to really upgrade infrastructure, upgrade fast rail, for example, upgrade 5G, upgrade ports, upgrade renewable energy, upgrade long distance power transmission. So the Belt and Road Initiative is promoting Chinese exports, but like trade, it's mutually beneficial for the other side, which builds infrastructure. And I think that this is the path for China that will be successful, which is if the US closes itself to China's goods, export elsewhere. The world is a very large place, and it needs China's technology. It needs China's capacity to produce large-scale, low-cost infrastructure. If you ride the maglev or Chinese fast rail or Chinese 5G, it's good stuff. And the rest of the world wants that. And the United States, by closing the US market, well, it'll cost the US. But China has alternatives. And I think that that's what we will see and what the Brics enlargement is about.
All right, let's do one more for the professor from Ralph Steiner. This is an interesting one. Might Jeffrey give us his opinion as to why Ethiopia was added? What does Ethiopia add to the Brics?
Yeah, very interesting. Ethiopia is 120 million people. It is a very significant culture. It has actually been a very fast-growing country for the past 15 years. China and Ethiopia have pretty deep relations, actually, and China built massive hydropower for Ethiopia and also rail for Ethiopia, which is making a very big difference. The criterion for Brics enlargement principally was systemically important countries. And interestingly, of course, China looks ahead. We always look backward, and with also tremendous disdain mixed with a strong dose of racism. We think Ethiopia, what's that? But Ethiopia in 20 years will look very, very different. It'll be much richer. It's dynamic. It actually has a culture that is very deep and goes back to Herodotus in the 5th century BCE with the onward, and China gets it. I think it was very clever for China to focus on Egypt and on Ethiopia, two ancient civilizations, both very sizable, both very interesting places with deep cultures, and I think strong national visions of development, and therefore good partners for China and for the Brics more generally.